Today we're going to be talking about the accuracy of the spinal tap in diagnosing multiple sclerosis. And with multiple sclerosis, the spinal tap or lumbar puncture is used as a diagnostic tool to diagnose MS. And what they're looking for is antibodies. And that's really important because we have to get past all the biology. And today we're going to talk about how accurate is this test? What is this test? And does it also confirm that multiple sclerosis and other neurological diseases that where they're finding the increased presence of antibodies in the central nervous system, is that because these are infectious diseases? If we haven't met, my name is Pam Bartha, and I am the author of Become a Wellness Champion and the founder of Live Disease Free. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis over 35 years ago, and it's really sad that nothing has really changed in the world of multiple sclerosis. We have more expensive drugs, we have very expensive ways of testing, but unfortunately, there still is no cause and there is no known cure. And today we're going to talk about, if you know anything about spinal taps, I've never had one done, thank goodness. The neurologist said, I don't want to put you through that. He had enough evidence that he felt that I had MS, but it's not a very comfortable procedure. And it actually confirms that MS is an infectious disease, and we'll talk more about that. So today it's like what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to simplify the science for you, the biology, the medical science, so that you understand where we're at, why we're not finding a cure, what direction you need to go if you would like to recover. Because the way that we're going, there is no hope, really. And so I'm going to give you hope at the end. And make sure to say hello and type in your questions in the question box as we get going. So the spinal tap. And the spinal tap is a procedure where they're looking for infections, and they're also looking for bleeding in the brain or in the central nervous system. They're looking for demyelinating diseases. They're also looking for cancer. So it's not just multiple sclerosis, but it could be other conditions and other diseases. I just want to make sure that I am live because I cannot see you. Let's see here, just refresh this. Yes, I am. Awesome. So the spinal tap is looking for different things, for different kinds of diseases, trying to diagnose. So it's not just looking at the spinal fluid is not just for multiple sclerosis. But with multiple sclerosis, there are some very characteristic signs that they find. So the spinal tap, or sometimes it's called the lumbar puncture, it's one tool that's used to help diagnose MS. And they're using a small needle and they're putting it into the lower part of our back, and they're drawing out a small sample of cerebrospinal fluid. So I'm going to call that CSF instead of saying it all the time. So that just means it's spinal fluid that's in your brain and spinal cord, and that's CSF. So this fluid is then used on a specific test, and it's called Electrophoresis. And in that test, they're basically putting some of the spinal fluid on some gel, and I'm just going to simplify it down, but basically this test, it's separating proteins based on their weight and different properties. So basically it's separating whatever proteins would be in our spinal fluid. And so there's always going to be a little bit of different, there could be some IgG, and we're going to talk about antibodies being IgG, so we'll just talk about the IgG antibodies. But there will be some present normally, but in MS, there are several bands. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's see here. So a certain type of antibody called the IGG antibody, there can be different clones of it. And so with multiple sclerosis, the term that they're using when they're looking at the test results, they're looking for oligoclonal IgG bands. So what that means is that when they put the spinal fluid on the gel and they run it through the test, then different antibodies are going to weigh different amounts. And so they're going to, like, one type of antibody is going to line up as one band, and then another type of antibody is going to line up as another band. So they see all of these different little stripes, and they're called bands. And that just means that there's a few antibodies all clustered together to form that band, and they cluster together because they have about the same weight. And so there's a few different things they have to consider when they're using this in diagnosing MS. And I'm just going to move over here. So for multiple sclerosis, there has to be 2 or more of those bands. They look like little stripes. So they'll take at the same time, they'll take some of your blood or our blood, and they'll run it through the same test, and they'll look for bands in our blood. And then they'll also look for these bands in our spinal fluid. And if it's in both the blood and the spinal fluid, then they say, well, that's not indicating there's inflammation in the central nervous system. They just want to see that there are the bands in the central nervous system, but not in the spinal fluid, but not in our blood. So we have to have 2 or more of those bands, meaning there's 2 or more different types of these monoclonal antibodies, or I should say oligoclonal antibodies. So oligo means more than one or several. So oligo means several. Clonal means of the same clone. So several clones. So these are several different antibodies. So they're not just one antibody. Keep that in mind too, because that's really important. Because we talk about MS being a disease of dysbiosis, where we have several infections out of place, or several infections that we're dealing with. So backtracking, so with multiple sclerosis, one test is the spinal tap or lumbar puncture, where they're taking some of our spinal fluid and they're running it through this test, which separates out proteins, and antibodies are proteins. Antibodies are made by our immune system to help fight infection. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. So that is the purpose in the world of science. That is the purpose of an antibody. It's to help protect our body from toxins and from infections. So then with multiple sclerosis, what they're finding is when they run this test and they can look at our blood and they can look at our spinal fluid, they're seeing that there won't be the bands in our blood, but there will be those bands, and each band represents a different type of antibody, and they'll find that in the spinal fluid of MS. So that indicates that there are several different types of antibodies present in the central nervous system in higher amounts than should be. And it's really like when we talk about oligoclonal bands, we don't know what that means. We don't know, like, I had no idea what that meant until I looked it up, and it's like, oh, that's just antibodies? Well, I know what antibodies are, and I know what antibodies do. And so this is why it's so important to simplify the science, so that we can actually see and we can actually understand why we don't have a cure yet, why we're moving in the wrong direction. And I'll wrap that up at the end. So again, to be diagnosed with MS, you've got to have 2 or more bands. And in the 2017 McDonald criteria, this is how they diagnose multiple sclerosis. So before, like they would say that, or with a criteria, they would say that you have to have lesions showing up in different locations. So you have to have different lesions, and this is over time. So it's not like you only get lesions once and nothing changes. It's not that, like, they expect that some will come and go and increase and decrease. And they also have to, over time, you have to get some in different parts of the central nervous system. So when a person is thinking that they might have MS and they're going to the neurologist and they've only had one attack, so they have this clinical isolated syndrome, in that situation, the neurologist before would say, well, you've only had one attack, so that doesn't meet the McDonald criteria. We'll have to wait for you to have another attack to see if you have MS or not, because the lesions haven't changed over time, and that's what they need to look at with an MRI. But now with the spinal tap, with the newest guidelines, they've said, well, if you have a lumbar puncture, if you have, let's say, one attack and you have a lot of clinical symptoms of MS, and then you get the lumbar puncture done and you've got more than 2 bands, they feel that that is a strong enough case for a diagnosis for MS, and then they would put that patient on MS drugs earlier. So they get a diagnosis earlier and they would be put on medications earlier. And I'm not saying that they would only just look at the lumbar puncture. They look at clinical, they look at the MRI, and they look at the spinal tap results or the lumbar puncture results. But the problem is they're all talking about lesions and they're talking about antibodies, and we're not talking about what is causing the lesions and what is causing the antibodies. We know that it is the immune system is fighting something, right? And they're like, well, it's just fighting our own tissue, so we just need to shut it down with the MS drugs. So let's go back to this. So that is one reason that they would use a lumbar puncture, so that they can get an earlier diagnosis for their patient. And, it's, again, going on those disease-modifying drugs is not going to cure us, unfortunately. And we are only on them as long as our body can handle it, and then we're switched to a different one and switched to a different one. So let's talk a little bit more about antibodies. We're talking about, there's different types of antibodies. There's IgM, IgA. We're just talking about IgG today. And so it's a type of antibody that is produced by B cells and plasma cells, and they are proteins. So antibodies are proteins that our immune system makes to neutralize toxins and also neutralize different types of pathogens, parasites like bacteria, but also viruses and maybe other smaller microbes. And what they'll do is they will neutralize them, or they will also tag them. So they're like some of them, when I was back in university, they look like a little fork or a little, like the shape of a Y, a capital Y. And they would just, they adhere to the bacteria, to whatever the antigen is. They call it antigen, which is a foreign enemy for the immune system. So it could be a toxin, could be metals, but it's usually infection. And so they will cluster on them and neutralize them and tag them so that other immune cells can come and gobble them up and get rid of them. And the antibodies are also important for activating other parts of the immune system. So our immune system is very complex. It's very sophisticated. And it has each part of the immune system has very specific jobs. So when there are very small amounts of this antibody in our central nervous system, in our spinal fluid, the IgG antibody, it's fine. But at certain times, there can be higher amounts of IgG antibodies in our spinal fluid. And they say, well, that's associated with inflammation. But if you follow my work, you know that inflammation is the body's response to infection. When we're talking about chronic disease, if you fall off your bike or if you get in a car accident, that kind of inflammation is different. But inflammation is really, in disease, it's the result, it's kind of like the war of where your immune system is fighting infection. So it's like there's an elephant in the room, and our standard of care is ignoring the elephant, walking around the elephant, can't see the elephant. The elephant is infection, is different types of parasites. And they're like, well, there's these lesions and our immune system is fighting something and we can't figure out what it is. We don't want to look at the spinal fluid for parasites, but we don't know what it is. It must be attacking. Oh, and then they'll say, well, it's attacking, different parts of the myelin. And it's like, well, when the myelin is being damaged by parasites and there's debris or there's sick or damaged cells, our immune system, that's part of its job, is the cleanup, right? So more on this. All right, so these antibodies are normally present in small amounts and it's not a problem, but high amounts is definitely linked with different types of infections and also inflammatory conditions. That's a mysterious, we know that it's to do with infections and autoimmune disease, and I've done lots of different talks on that. And that autoimmune disease is an insult to our immune system. autoimmune disease, and I've done a video, if you haven't watched that, watch it, where I said that you can't have autoimmunity or autoimmune diseases without some type of parasite present. So these IgG oligoban or oligocolonial bands, and I'll just call them, I don't want to lose you in the science here. So I'm just going to say these bands of antibodies, these specific bands of antibodies. They're detected. Remember, you have to have 2 lines. You have to have at least 2 lines to get a diagnosis of MS. So they're not present in every MS case. They're in about 90% of people diagnosed with MS. These bands are present when they're doing that test. And there is a really big problem because these bands of antibodies, are not unique to multiple sclerosis. They're found in different types of infections. I'm going to put all of this together in my notes in our blog post that will be released either Thursday or Friday this week. And then you'll be able to click on links. You'll be able to look at it deeper if you want. I'm just trying to give you a bird's eye simplified view so that it makes sense. I don't want to lose you in the scientific jargon. So one study where they found these bands of antibodies, when they tested the spinal fluid through this test, and they found these different lines, so different types of antibodies, where it was associated with measles antibody activity. So this was one study that showed in 5 out of 7 MS patients, part of those antibody bands appear to be associated with measles antibody activity. So that's a virus. And another study found that a certain fungus was the problem. So this was Cryptococcus neoformans, and that caused specific antibodies in the spinal fluid in a condition called cryptococcal meningitis. So these are infectious diseases where they are able to find these bands. Remember, antibodies are going after infection. So it could be viruses, it can be fungi. And then a third study, the oligoclonal Borrelia burgdorferi. So Borrelia burgdorferi is one type of bacteria is one species of the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So they found antibodies specific to this Borrelia in the spinal fluid, and we know that Lyme can be present in the central nervous system, and it's called Lyme neuroborreliosis. And so in that situation, you'll find these bands of antibodies. So if somebody has Lyme disease in their central nervous system, and they get the lumbar puncture done, and they find these different bands, that is linked with Lyme disease or neuroborreliosis. And I've done on my masterclass training, I talk about and neurosyphilis is another one where they're finding these bands of antibodies. Again, we're looking just to see if there's inflammation. The immune system is fighting infection in the central nervous system, but not in the rest of the body. And that's why they test the blood and the spinal fluid at the same time. Because if it's in the blood and the spinal fluid, then they don't feel that's MS. But we don't really care if we have it in the blood and the spinal fluid. It's like, okay, we've got parasites in the blood, and now we also have it in the central nervous system, so we need to treat both. But then these bands of antibodies, these oligocolonial bands, they can also be found in many different diseases. So just a few, this is not conclusive. Neuromyelitis optica, lupus, neurosarcoidosis, subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, subarachnoid hemorrhage, primary central nervous system lymphoma, and Sjogren's disease or syndrome, and Guillain-Barré syndrome, meningeal carcinomatosis, multiple myeloma, Perry-Romberg syndrome, and many other diseases that mimic multiple sclerosis. So I shared with you last week that there are over 100 diseases that mimic multiple sclerosis when they're looking at the images on the MRI, the MRI images, when they're doing an MRI and they're taking the images, and there are a lot of different conditions, over 100 of them, that will have lesions in the central nervous system and can mimic multiple sclerosis. And then there are these paraneoplastic disorders. It's a rare subgroup of disorders that, this is really interesting, where the immune system has a reaction to a cancerous tumor. So they're like, maybe if our immune system is reacting to a cancerous tumor, maybe there is infection present there. Maybe an infection is causing the cancer. There are so many parasite drugs that are anti-cancer drugs. And there's so much evidence that cancer is an infectious disease. So when you have these rare disorders where your immune system is reacting to a cancerous tumor, maybe it's doing its job and it's going after an infection, a parasite. So there's Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome, stiff person syndrome, encephalomyelitis, myasthenia gravis, cerebral degeneration, limbic or brain encephalitis, neuromyotonia, and opsicolis, and sensory neuropathy. So this is not conclusive. So there, you can see that they're using, and this is why there are so many people that are misdiagnosed with multiple sclerosis and other neurological diseases too, because it's like, well, the lesions are usually this way, but not always this way with MS. And there's all these 100 of other diseases that can cause lesions in the central nervous system. And then if we do a lumbar puncture, then it's fairly characteristic to have 2 or up to 10 or even more of these little lines or stripes of these bands of antibodies. I really believe that those separate bands of antibodies, they're different antibodies and they're fighting maybe possibly different types of infections. We know that Borrelia is very, very commonly found in multiple sclerosis. There's different types of worms. There's fungi. I've got a whole bunch of evidence on our website, livediseasefree.com, livediseasefree.com. In the main menu, click on that, go down to evidence that multiple sclerosis is an infectious disease, and you'll see that. So when we're dealing with MS, ALS, PLS, Parkinson's, we're dealing with multiple infections. We're dealing with a state of being in dysbiosis. And then, yes, we will have, obviously, and the research I've done is like the more bands that you have, those oligoclonal bands, the more of them that you have, so those are more different types of antibodies, then the more disabling it is for people. So it makes sense, because the sicker you are, the more infested you are with the different types of microbes. What's interesting too is that they only do the lumbar puncture once. They're like, if you've got these bands, you've got MS type thing. But again, they want to confirm it with MRI and clinical diagnosis. But what I don't want to see this, but what would be interesting is that if you get, let's say you have one attack and you have this clinical isolated syndrome and you get the lumbar puncture, I wouldn't recommend this because it's not a safe procedure. I don't like to poke anything into my central nervous system, but I wonder that if you have these infections in your central nervous system and it shows that you've got antibodies, your immune system is fighting, so maybe you have 2 bands or more, and then you go on these immunosuppressive drugs, I wonder in 5 years if you have even more bands, and they don't check that. They're like, no, if you have the 2 bands, that's once is good enough. And I'm happy they don't do that more often, because again, when you puncture with a needle into the central nervous system, you could introduce infection, and you can have some spinal fluid leakage. That's why you have to lay down for a couple of hours, or you can have massive headaches. And the way that we're using it, like it's such important information. And if you could be like Dr. Alan McDonald, where they're taking the spinal fluid and they're actually getting pathologists to deep dive in to see which types of infections are present. He found small filarial worms and the eggs and mating and their larvae, the immature forms. He found Borrelia. He found the juvenile, or I should say the immature, developing tapeworm larval cysts in the central nervous system. And this was in every MS patient that or subject, they had passed away. So this was for research. But they were clinically diagnosed with MS, confirmed, safe for research, and he found this on a shoestring budget. So why can't we duplicate? Why can't they try to prove him wrong? Why can't they do some more studies to see if anyone else can find these tapeworm larval cysts in the central nervous system, Borrelia in the central nervous system, how common it is? Like, this is really important. So now we have over 80 autoimmune diseases, and for all of them, there is no known cause, there is no cure. We just take immunosuppressive drugs because they're called autoimmune, where your immune system is attacking itself, and that is completely wrong. And it's very good for business, but it is not good for us. All right, so the IgG antibodies are apparently directed against different types of myelin. So that is what we're told. They're saying that these IgG antibodies are like attacking different parts of the myelin, but there is conflicting, and I literally just did this quickly, so you can probably find other research, but the conflicting evidence that I found was one study where they shared. So basically what I'm trying to say is that with IgG antibodies, those bands, they feel that those bands of antibodies, they're autoantibodies, are just attacking the myelin for no reason. Like, there's no infection there. It's just for some reason they've gone haywire. And that's why so many of the disease-modifying drugs are really immunosuppressive. They're going after the B cells. Our B cells are immune cells that produce antibodies. And this is a very important part of our natural defense, because if we get an infection, the B cells will produce antibodies so that the next time we get that same infection, there's a much quicker response. It remembers. And that is part of, so we have this first immune system where there's first responders, and then we have this other immune part of our system, I'm trying to keep it really simple, where it remembers and it protects us in the future, so that if we ever get another, invasion of a certain microbe, then if our immune system has experienced that before, it'll be like pumping out antibodies quickly, and the immune system goes after it and deals with it very quickly so that we don't get sick. That's why we can't get rid of our B cells. We need them to protect us. And if it is true that our B cells are just producing antibodies against our own myelin and our own tissue, then why is it that when we treat parasites, we're fine? Our immune system is no longer attacking itself, because it never was in the beginning. Our immune system attacks sick cells. It attacks, maybe there has been damage done to some of the cells because of the infection. Maybe some of the cells are infected. It will clean up the debris. Absolutely. That's its job. So the conflicting part that I wanted to share with you, that I literally just found just before doing this call here, and again, I'll share all the links so you guys can do some deeper dives. Go ahead and type your questions in. I can take a couple minutes to answer questions. But in this study, I'm going to just read the quote of it. Plasma cell clones are not, so those are cells that are producing antibodies, okay? So these cells, like a specialized B cell, are not directed against the well-characterized myelin protein. So in their experience, in their study, they found that these B cells, the clones, were not creating antibodies against these different myelin proteins. One is called MBP, the next one is PLP, and the third one is MOG. So these are just some of the myelin proteins that it's believed that the antibodies are attacking these myelin proteins, and they're like, Well, we did a study and we did not find that they were attacking them at all, and that they did not readily stain MS lesions. So, if it should, they should stain MS lesions if it is truly what they think that it's doing. So they said this raises an interesting conundrum regarding their specificity and the research for antigenic targets of the cerebrospinal fluid oligoclonal bands. So they're basically saying that this is kind of like against what we thought. We thought that the antibodies were attacking myelin proteins, and they're not. And we also found that they're not going into the MS lesions. And so this is like, okay, we've got a bit of a problem here. We're trying to figure out, what are these antibodies doing? Like, they're not going after myelin? What are they going after? Maybe it's infections. Maybe we should start looking for infections and not just viruses. So then they shared, our findings indicate that the B cell response in MS is partially directed against intracellular autoantigens released during tissue destruction. So tissue destruction is happening, and their findings indicate that the B cell response in MS, remember the B cells are making antibodies. So in MS patients, this B cell response is going after intracellular, so it's basically components of our cells that are just floating around damaged because there has been cell destruction, tissue destruction from the parasites. And I have shown you in my masterclass training also how the myelin can actually become infected with Borrelia. Borrelia can actually get into the myelin of that nerve cell. So, of course, our immune system is going to go after that, right? Whether it's our T cells or our B cells or macrophages, there's specialized ones in the central nervous system. And so, if you're tired of living on these MS drugs and just feeling worse and worse and finding that you're still becoming disabled, the reason is that you're suppressing your soldiers, you're suppressing your immune system, your natural defense that protects you from infection. It makes us weaker when we suppress our B cells and our T cells. We don't want to interfere. So it's really sad because a lot of this research I was looking at, it's done by pharmaceutical companies, and they're like, well, this is interesting. We could try to make antibodies in the future. And it's just like, the immune system is so smart. Like, we don't want more drugs. We just want to treat the cause, and we want to get on with our life. And if it's an old drug that is not patented anymore, then so be it. These newer drugs are costing hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, just in MS, and that's not cancer and arthritis and every other disease. They're costing hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. Never mind the MRI visits, never mind the doctors, etc. I don't even understand where the money is coming from. I know we're all working harder, and I know we're all paying a lot more taxes, but we're suffering. We're suffering terribly, and a lot of people have lost years and years of their life, and there is no need for it. So if you're brand new to all of this, actually, I'm going to go to some of your questions here for a minute, and then I will wrap it up. I get to go babysitting tonight. So Jennifer shared, so I had a spinal tap done, and the neurologist said that I have MS from some bands that were there. I don't remember what they were called. So they're always called oligoclonal bands, and that just means many of the same, like clone means similar, so many. So you're going to see different lines. So like, let's say one antibody is heavier, one type of antibody is heavier. So each antibody goes after a different antigen. Antigen can be a toxin, it can be an infection. It's something that should not be in your central nervous system. And the heavier antibodies, because they're different sizes, they are going to be at the bottom of the list of the stripes. And then the lighter antibodies, they will collect together and make a different stripe. And then maybe another group of antibodies, they're a little bit smaller or lighter, and they'll be another. So that's where you can have these bands. And each band represents a type of antibody that is going after a different type of antigen. Hello, Natalia. Hi, Lee. I had a spinal tap done when you were first diagnosed. Let me know how that went for you, because apparently it's very, very uncomfortable. Years ago, I watched somebody, I was thinking about going into a certain profession where they, I think they just collect the spinal fluid. And I watched, this was many years ago when I was just coming out of high school. And the guy that was having the spinal tap, he was just groaning on the table so terribly. And I know now it's different. They freeze the area, but it's still not a pleasant experience. And what we're using it for is not helpful for recovering. It's only helpful to kind of give us the label earlier and get us on the disease modifying drugs earlier, and they won't give us the life that we want. Another Facebook user had the spinal tap done, your first diagnosis, and the person actually missed the first stick and poked you again. I am so sorry. You had the worst headache ever. Apparently, when you have a spinal tap, you have to lay down for a while because they've drawn a little bit of the fluid out, and some can actually leak out of the hole from the needle. So you're supposed to just lay for a while to avoid that. And then Bassett, my results were normal, no bands, but they still diagnosed you with MS, and it was primary progressive multiple sclerosis. So again, not everyone has these bands. There is no single test for multiple sclerosis. After I've been diagnosed 35 years ago, and we still don't have a single test to diagnose MS. Is that acceptable? Think about it. Like, is it that hard? I don't think so. And Jennifer, you had your first spinal tap in the hospital, then you got admitted for what you didn't know at the time was your first flare. It came out of nowhere, but the one they did, the first one they did was clear, but the one they did 3 months later showed that you had you had the bands, I would assume. Hi, Rose. Hi, Graham. Haven't heard from you for a while. You had spinal tap done and tested positive for 7 bands. I'm curious, do you have like a lot of neurological symptoms? Has the disease been really tough for you? Like, is it a more severe case of MS? 7 bands is a fair bit of bands. You had them test the spinal fluid for Lyme disease, but it was incomplete negative. Again, the testing for Lyme is not accurate, unfortunately. So my comment, I got a spinal tap at the first diagnosis. The person actually missed, I got that one already, sorry. That is horrible. And Mary, you're learning so much, way to go. And Kaylee, 4 bands in your spinal fluid, finally diagnosed with transverse myelitis. See, just lesions in the spine. This is so informative. Well, that's the thing, is you've got a different disease than we do, but your immune system is fighting something, and our immune system is fighting something when we have MS. It's just, it could be different infections. We know, like, if you go on to, it doesn't matter if you have MS or another neurological disease, look at the evidence that MS is an infectious disease, because the fungus will get into the central nervous system of people that have other neurological diseases, and also the Lyme infections. Protists will get in there. Worms, Dr. Alan McDonald's found, the neurocysticercosis, the tapeworm larval cysts, that's another big one. So the central nervous system is not a sterile environment. Infections, so that's the thing. Fact number 1, the central nervous system is not a sterile environment. Different microbes can cross the blood-brain barrier. Number 2, the main job of our immune system is to defend us from infection. So that's where we need to be looking, because that is its main job. Yes, toxins for sure. Like, is there any toxins in your environment? But for most of us, we live in a fairly clean environments, right? We're not living by some kind of radioactive area, or we don't have huge amounts of some terrible pesticide or industrial toxin put in our water, right? Because then we see a lot of people with same problems in an area. So we know that our immune system is fighting something. Our immune system's main job is to defend us from infection. And we know that it's been proven that there are different microbes different infections that cause lesions. Many different parasites cause lesions in the central nervous system. I did a blog post on that. And then there are different infections that also cause these oligoclonal bands that we see, those stripes, those groups of different sizes of different types of antibodies that are present in the central nervous system. And yes, this way of running healthcare is very lucrative, but we're suffering terribly. And the only way things can change is if you pick a different path. So when I was 28 years old, I was told I was going to be in a wheelchair. There was no hope for me. I'd be completely disabled in time. And by the grace of God, I learned early on that multiple sclerosis was caused by parasites. So I decided very early on to take a different path. And because I did, I have been able to live MS free now for 35 years. I had another child. I now have my 7th grandchild is on her way in a couple of months. And I have been so blessed to raise my family now. After work tonight, I'll be playing with 4 little grandkids and to live a full life. I went hiking over the last weekend for a couple of hours, and I can do whatever I want because I decided not to buy into that system. And so you're the only one who can make that decision for yourself. If you love the medications, if you feel that's your right answer, go for it. But you'll find in time that you will become more and more disabled because it's not treating the cause. And I'm not against pharmaceutical treatments, but if you're not treating the cause, it's going to get worse over time. And if we suppress our immune system, we become weaker and weaker over time. And then the parasites become stronger over time. So if all of this is new to you, I encourage you to watch my videos. First of all, go to our website, livediseasefree.com. Wonderful blog posts every week, different topics. There's links there if you might be a reader you might not want to watch a video, or maybe you like to put the video on while you're cooking or whatever you're doing. You can pick either or, but it's all concise there. Share that with other groups. Get talking in different communities about, could we be dealing with parasites? Could we be dealing with infections? It makes so much more sense. And it's going to take an outcry from the general population before things are going to change. And it's going to take a long time. And if you're not ready, if you're not prepared to live like this for more years, then make sure to watch my masterclass training, where I tell you all the steps that we take to recover from these parasites. Then you can book a time to chat with me. You can become a wellness champion, and you can start on your journey recovering from the parasitic infestation if you're dealing with chronic disease. And it's not just multiple sclerosis. Many other diseases are also, pretty much all the diseases are caused by, the biggest cause would be infection. Yes, we can have heavy metals. We got to deal with that. And we got to clean up our lifestyle. We use a holistic approach. But the biggest cause of our symptoms would be different types of parasites. And we can help you. We can help you get the right treatments, we've got a plan, a proven plan called the Live Disease Free Plan. So make sure to check that out if you need support. I would love to support you. I would be honored to support you. And please like and share and subscribe if you enjoy these educational talks. I put a lot of time researching. I'm researching all the time. And I'm just on a mission. I'm on a mission to help bring clarity to what we're dealing with and help to really help people to see very clearly what they're dealing with so that they can pick the best path to get their health and their life back. So with that, I would like to let you guys go. Have a wonderful day and the rest of the week. Take care. Bye-bye for now.